Hi, Mikhail, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Um, the session will be about version control with PhpStorm and other IntelliJ IDEA-based IDEs. Now, just one word of warning. I will be using the term PhpStorm during every demo that I'm doing. I will be using PhpStorm, but as Mikhail stated already, everything that I'm showing can be done using other IntelliJ IDEA-based IDEs. So WebStorm, PyCharm, RubyMine, IntelliJ, and so on. So another word of warning, I will, well, it's kind of an introductory version control session as well. So I know there's people not using version control already. I know there's people interested in starting to use it. So we'll start with a quick 5-minute or 10-minute overview of what version control is, and then we'll dive into the IDE and see how you can use version control from within the IDE. So if you're already using version control, if you're a Git master, for example, bear with me for the first 10 minutes, and then we'll dive into the IDE. So first of all, version control. I don't know if you ever had the situation where you made a change to code and realized it was a mistake and wanted to go back. And typically in your IDE, you have something like an undo and redo function. But if you close the IDE or if you close the editor, you're basically done with it. Your code is lost. Which is another thing you can have. You can lose code or maybe have a backup of your code which is too old, or you're working on a network share somewhere and for some reason there's data corruption happening in the transfer to the web, to the network share, and you're losing codes. Probably you've had to maintain multiple versions of a product, maybe a version 1 and a version 2 at the same time, or a version 1 and a version specific to one specific customer. Maybe you wanted to know who did a change in your team. So if you're working in a team with a couple of people, maybe someone did a change and maybe you're finding out a bug and you want to know why a certain change happened, who did this, when this was done, and perhaps why. Maybe you want to see the difference between two versions of your code. Maybe you want to see the difference between a version from 1 week ago and the current version you have. Maybe you want to prove that a particular change broke some piece of code. Or maybe you want to just change some code. Basically, whenever you're having issues or whenever you're having questions about your source code, not at a technical level, but more about the why, the where, the when, and the who, I think source control may be the answer. So with version control or source control, you basically keep a log of all changes that are happening to your code. So whenever you make a change to your code, or whether that's in one file or whether that's in a couple of files, you're basically synchronizing those changes with a centralized copy or a decentralized copy, which we'll see in a minute. And you're synchronizing those copies across computers and developers. And this practice allows you to go back in time. It allows you to see who did what, when, and why. So in the image you can see on screen, you can see this is basically a change log which is coming from a project I'm working on. You can see that one person, Mark in this case, did some changes. We can see a comment for those changes. So we can see, for example, that he made a fix to something. And you can browse the code from there as well. So you can click through to the codes. And that's basically what version control is. It gives you a log of what happens, why, and by whom. It allows you to compare versions, and maybe that's another very nice thing about source control. It also allows you to roll back versions or work on different versions of your source code at the same time. And I think that's pretty valuable in every project. So quick question, when do I use version control? Well, if you're not using it, take my advice for it all the time. Use version control all the time. It will help you find out whatever is happening inside your code base. It will help you find out why something is happening, and it will give you a complete overview of whatever happens over the course of time to your code base. And it's really easy to do code reviews, find out why a bug is in some portion of your code base, and so on. So when do you use it? All the time. There are some concepts related to source control. One very important one is the repository itself. So basically what happens is if you're using version control, what will happen is you are pushing your sources to a repository. And that repository can be a local repository, so basically some sort of a database sitting on your local system, or it can be a remote repository. So for example, if you're using Subversion, what you typically do is you create a remote repository somewhere on a server, and you push all your changes that you're doing in your code to that remote repository, so that everything at a given point in time is always available from that central remote repository. There's also the concept of checking out or cloning, which is basically fetching a copy from the repository. Now, depending on the source control system you are using, this will either be fetching the latest version of all the sources in there, or fetching the entire repository. So for example, with Git source control, you always fetch a complete copy of the remote repository into a local repository. Another concept is committing changes. So basically that's saying to the version control system, look, the changes that I have on my disk here, I want you to persist them, tag my name on it, tag a timestamp on it, and add a description to that thing. So that's a commit. All those commits, basically once they are inside your repository, they are called a revision or a change set. And a change set or a revision is typically the combination of what changed, when, who did it, and why did this happen. The actual changes, which can be additions, which can be modifications, and so on. And they are stored in order. So if you look at the revision list or the list of change sets in any source control system, you will see they are stored in order, and the further you go down, the earlier version you will be seeing. Now, of course, not everything always works out of the box with source control. You can have conflicts. For example, if you're working with a team member on the same file, it may happen that you're working on the same file at the same line of code. And whenever you synchronize your repositories, you will see that there are conflicts. And solving those conflicts is one of the things that you will be doing when working with source control. But it allows you to know why something happened and maybe see why something happens twice at the same line of code in your code base. Solving conflicts or comparing previous versions with another version or the current version is called diffing or diff. It's basically viewing the differences between two versions of your source code or your repository. And then, of course, there's branching and merging, which is a slightly advanced concept that you have in source control, where you can basically create a separate branch of your source code on which you can work separately from the main branch. And at a given point in time, you will merge those branches back into the main branch, which may go to your production system, for example. There are some different flavors of version control. You have centralized version control systems, where you typically have a central repository somewhere, which is the entire history of your code base. So this central repository will contain all revisions, all change sets for whatever happens in that code base. Whenever a developer wants to work on the code stored in this central repository, they typically clone or check out a version, and they work on that specific version, and whenever they commit, they synchronize again with the centralized version control system. There's another flavor of version control, which is the decentralized version control system. And well, what you will see there is that you can have multiple copies of the entire repository. So if you look at things like Git, for example, what you have there is every developer or every server on which you store your code base contains the entire history, contains the entire repository, which also means if you are fetching sources from this decentralized version control, you are just making a copy of the entire history. You work on a version, you commit locally, so everything you do and commit to the repository will happen locally, and then at a given point in time you can choose to push to a different repository, which may be some form of a central version control system, like for example you do with GitHub. There you are working on a decentralized copy of a centralized repository, but you will basically synchronize between either you and GitHub, or between multiple developers or multiple branches and so on. We'll see in a minute how this works in practice. There's different products on the market. For centralized version control, you have CVS, you have Subversion, there's Perforce, there's Team Foundation Server, there's a couple more. And at the decentralized version control side, you have Git, you have Mercurial, you have TFS using the Git source control, and so on. Now, a good question there may be, Maarten, you told me I should use source control all the time, and I completely still agree with that statement. But which version or which version control system should I be choosing? Well, it all depends on how you like to work, how your workflow is. For example, a centralized version control has a slightly different workflow than a decentralized version control system. Git and Mercurial are more or less the same in how they work, except that Mercurial stores everything in a central repository in binary format. Git does this in a text-based format, so it's easier to mingle and change revisions and so on. So basically, what do you choose? It will depend on how you like to work with your code base. So I cannot give you solid advice there, which fits every scenario. But if you have questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter or through email. Now, all version control systems, well, they are different. They use different terms for the same concept, basically. So if you're doing a checkout, that may be called cloning or exporting. A commit may be called check-in. A push may be called a submit. A revert may be called a rollback. History may be log, and so on and so on. While they are all different terms, actually every source control system is sort of similar in nature. And that's why in IntelliJ IDEA-based IDEs, you will see that there's a unified version control functionality. So whether you're using CVS, Git, Subversion, Mercurial, Perforce, or whatever source control system that you're using in your team, you will see that most functions in the IDE are through a unified interface, providing all the options that you know or may see in other version control systems as well. Of course, if you're using Git instead of Subversion, there is some specific functionality like pushing and pulling. Of course, the IDE will know that you're using Git, and based on the type of version control system that you are using, it will add some additional menus and additional options to work with specific functionality, like, for example, a push and a pull. So with that, I think I'm about through my slides. So let's fire up our IDE and look at some demo. So I should be having my virtual machine here. Go full screen. There we are. Okay, so what I have here is a simple project containing some JavaScript files, some PHP files, and so on, and I would like to push this one into source control. Now, before we do that, I want to quickly show you the VCS menu, which is where all the magic with source control and version control systems happen. We have this VCS menu where you have a local history, where you can enable version control integration, where you can check out from version control, which we'll do in a minute, or import into version control. So the project I have open here is one that I cannot, which is not yet in a version control system. So right from within my IDE, I can select to import it into CVS or create a Git repository for it, or share it on GitHub, or create a Mercurial repository, and so on. Basically, no matter what you do here, everything that will be shown is pretty similar. It will select you where you want to store the local repository when you're doing Git. It will ask you the same thing when you're doing Mercurial. If you're doing CVS, it will ask you where you want to import your source code to. Now, this is pretty straightforward to do. The only thing you need is either a centralized location somewhere to store your source control system, or a server online somewhere. Now, I will not be using the import functionality. I will just check out from source control and open an existing project. So I will be doing all demos using Git and my, as you know, that's a decentralized version control repository. But there's also GitHub, which is some sort of a centralized version control repository. Now, why is this important to know? Basically, what I will be doing here is having one central location to store the one truth I see in my software system, which will be hosted on GitHub for free in this project. So if you want to follow along, you can also clone this one and work in there. Basically, this is on GitHub, a hosted repository that I will be cloning inside my PhpStorm project, and I'll be working with that one. So let's go there. Let's open the VCS menu, check out from version control, and select GitHub. Again, you see there's different source control systems here that you can use. So let's select GitHub. I can specify my username and passwords. Let's do that as well. And then I will be able to select the repository that I want to clone from GitHub. There we go. It will bring down a list of all the version control repositories I have on GitHub. And in my case, that's a pretty long list, so I'm not going to search in there. I will just go to GitHub and copy the URL to this repository and paste it here. And I'll just store this thing on my desktop. There we go. So let's clone this repository from GitHub. And as you can see at the bottom here, you see it's cloning the repository from GitHub. There's also this version control tool window, which I can open, which will give you the output of everything that's happening in the back. So you see that PhpStorm, in this case, changed the working directory to my desktop. It issued a git clone, and it's fetching all the data. So it's finished right now. And now it's asking me if I want to open the directory to which I cloned the project from GitHub. So let's go there. I want to open it in this window. All right, there we are. What's the difference with any project you open in PhpStorm or your IDE? Well, not really anything. All my files are in there. I can see my Readme, for example. There's my license. There's some tests. There's some source code as well. So it's pretty much boilerplate, however you use your project typically. Now the only difference is that this time there's a source control system linked to my project. So if you now open the VCS menu, you will see there's different operations now. I can update my project, I can commit changes, I can show changes, I can refresh the file status. Those are all unified operations that will be available on any source control system. But as you can see, since I'm using Git, there's an additional menu which shows me all the functionality that's specific to working with the Git source control system. So let's make some changes and see how this all works. So I'm going to make some changes in my README. In my README, I added that the webinar will be held on October 2nd. Well, since it's in progress, this webinar, let's change that sentence and make it the webinar had place or took place on October 2nd. So I made a change there, and as you can see in my Project Explorer, my file name turns blue. Blue means that there has been a change since the last time I committed to my version control system. Also, if I create a new file, so let's say I want to add, I don't know, maybe an HTML file. Let's call it test.html. Yes, I want to add it to source control. So PhpStorm will always ask you if you want to add it to your source control system. So let's go there. And I can just start working. So let's add a header. Make it a PhpStorm webinar, maybe add some more texts, some lorem ipsums, for example. There we are. As you can see in the Project Explorer, we now have two files with a different color. The white ones are unchanged from the last time I committed. The blue one was the previous one, that's a change in my code base. And then this green one denotes that I've added a file. Now, if I didn't select that I wanted to add this one to my source control system, it would turn up red, which means it's not under source control. But in this case, I can see I have a modification pending and an addition pending. Now, are these things already under source control? No. I've just told PhpStorm, keep track of all the changes that I'm doing, but do not, well, PhpStorm will not automatically commit them to your source control system or to the repository. So what I can do now is either use the VCS menu and say I want to commit changes, or I can use the version control operations pop-up, which is old backtick on Windows, I don't know on Mac, And this will bring up this menu where I can commit changes. I can commit just one file. I can revert. I can view branches. I can push, and so on. Or I can use the Ctrl-K shortcut, which will bring this window, which is commit your changes. So what I can see here is all the changes that I've made during my, well, since my last commit I did. So I can see I changed the Readme. I can see I've added the test.html, and I can add a comment to this commit. So let's say added one file and made a change to readme.md. This is probably not the best description because you can see from the change log that I've done these changes and so on. Probably you want to add the reason why you did this, or maybe enter an issue title you have in your issue tracker or something like that. There's some other things we can do before committing to our repository. It's either selecting to reformat code automatically, maybe optimize imports, maybe perform a code analysis, or check to-dos in the project. Also, if you have a remote host configured, you can also upload files to a remote host whenever you commit. But I'm not going to do those things. I'm just going to commit to my repository. Now, since I'm using Git, you see different options here. I can commit, which means store the changes that you are seeing in the local repository, so in the local copy I have on my local system. Commit and push will do the same, but it will also push those changes to the remote repository, in my case here, which will be github.com. But let's just commit to my local repository. So as you can see now, we've committed our changes. PhpStorm says so. We have our test.html in there. And if we look at our GitHub projects and refresh the page there, you will see nothing changed. There has been made no change to readme.md, and there's no test.html in there. Why is this? Well, again, because I just committed to my local repository and I didn't yet push this thing to GitHub. Now, what's this local repository thing and where does it live? Well, it also depends on the type of source control system you are using, but with Git, for example, if I open my folder in Explorer, my project in Explorer, and I view all files, I can see there's this .git directory, and this .git directory contains the entire copy of my repository as well as the changes I've just added. So this test.html change is in there, and if I now decide to push this folder to GitHub, those changes will also be available from that repository. But it's probably best to not work with this folder directly and just make use of all the client tools available. So what can we do? Well, there's a couple of things we can do. As I've told you, we have a complete history of whatever happens in our repository. So let's bring that one up in our IDE. As you can see, there's this Changes tool window that you can open either by clicking or using the Alt-9 shortcut. You can see that there's a local history, which will contain all the changes that I'm making locally and that are not yet committed into source control. And I can also view the log. And as you can see, I can basically browse all the changes that I've made in the past hours, days, months, whatever. So you can see that I've added one file and made a change to readme.md. So I can see the description on what I did and why I did this in here. I can see who did it. So I can see my name in here, and 2 minutes ago, I made a change to this readme file. Also on the right here, I can see all the changes that were in there. So in here, I changed the readme.md and I added a test.html, and I can see that based on the color. Now, if I go further back in history, let's maybe go way back, I can see that in this one, I've added a test condition for testing a worksheet count somewhere in a file, and that file was the calculation engine test in there. So I can see all those things here, and if you're working with multiple branches, I'll not go into that too deeply, but you can also see that those branches will be shown here on the left by using this nice graphical tree of your source control system. Okay, what else can I do? If I return to this change I made earlier, to this added test condition for testing worksheet counts, I can right-click this one or use the toolbar buttons, and I can show a diff. This show diff will show a difference of the revision in this change set with the previous version. So if I show a diff, I can see exactly what I've added in this commit. So you can see on the left, that's the version before I added this test condition. And on the right, you can see the change I did. So I added a test condition there to assert that the sheet count is not null. Now maybe I want to diff not with the previous version of a specific file, but just with my local version. I can do the same thing, show diff with local, and I can see all the differences. In this case, apparently I'm still working on the same revision of this file, so I have no differences. But if I go, for example, to one of the Readme updates I did, and I show a diff there with local, I can see a lot of changes have happened over time. I can see I've changed some of the lines of code, so that's the blue again. And I've also added one line of code, which is this one, and I can see when I added it and where I added it. Also, you see that I have this remove option and so on. Basically, clicking this will not remove the line of code from my revision, but what will happen is if I do this and I open my README, you will see that my current version will have that change. So if I now do Control-K to commit my changes, you will see that this README has been updated because I decided to change the version with a previous thing. Which brings me to the next option we have with source control, which is reverting changes. If you look at the details for this change, you will see that I've well, it's kind of small on the screen, but you should see that I've added this line that I had in there before. I can just revert, and this will roll back the changes that I've done to the previous version. The color is no longer blue, and I can just see whatever is in there without any changes that I saw here. Other things I can do. Well, there's quite some other things I can do. For example, if I look at my README, I can, for example, annotate my README. So if I right-click my sorry, I'm first going to show something else. I can also open a repository version. So if I just want to see how a file looked, maybe last week at 11:41, I can have a look at my autoloader here, and I can open the repository version, and this will bring down the repository version. And as you can see, it's from the tab name, it's a version from earlier on. So I can just view that one. Okay, so there was one other thing I wanted to show you, which is annotations, or blaming, as some version control systems call this one. If I use my version control pop-up, so Alt backtick, I can go to the annotate option, and this will basically annotate my current file with all the changes that have happened. So I get to see which revision a given line of code was changed in. I can see when this happened. I can see who did this and which revision. So as you can see here, this line of code, the contact info here, was not added by me, but by some guy named Xavier. So I can right-click this one and open this one and see the entire revision in which Xavier changed this line of code. I can also see well, that I changed this line of codes. So I changed this one to took place on October 2nd. And if I click this one, I can also see the entire revision that I did and all the stuff that's in there. Okay, now this one is a particularly easy one or useful one if you are searching for a bug or you want to know why a given line of code is in a code file, because you can see the author of the code file. So in this case, imagine this was source code. I would go to this guy and ask him, why did you add this? Did you think through this scenario, and so on and so on. So I can see all those things in there. All right, let's make some more changes and explore some more scenarios that you can have. Maybe, and I'm going to do this through the GitHub UI, maybe I can also change this README file through the GitHub UI and just click edit there and add some additional info. Maybe add the PhpStorm Twitter account, so let's do that. Let's say find PhpStorm on Twitter. The handle is PhpStorm and PhpStorm in the link as well. So what I can do is also add a commit summary there. So let's say added PhpStorm Twitter account. and commit changes. As you can see now, our README has changed, so we have the Find PhpStorm on Twitter thingy in there. If I go back to my repository, you will also see that I've just changed the README. So just now I've changed the README. Does this already contain the change I did earlier? No, it still says the webinar is on October 2nd and not took place on October 2nd. So let's synchronize our changes with the centralized repository that I have on GitHub. I can do this again from the VCS menu and say I want to update the project. I can do this using the alt backtick VCS operations pop-up and say I want to fetch my changes, or I can simply use the Control-T shortcuts on Windows, which tells me that I can update my project. Again, depending on the source control system that you are using, you will see different options here. Since I'm using Git is kind of a special version control system, I have some options on how I want to update my source codes. For example, I can say merge, which will bring down the changes, which will look at my changes and try to merge them. And then I can commit that merge operation as well, so I can see whenever I brought two versions of my source code together. I can also do a rebase, where that history kind of gets lost, or I can just use the default one for the current branch. So let's go with that one. Click OK. And you can see it's now fetching sources from GitHub. Right after I've done that, you can also see from the from the changes tool window, whatever happened. So you can see that I've updated front server and that there's one item that was updated, which is the README file. You can also open this one, and as you can see, my change I've done through the website is in there, so this one. And you can also see that the change I did earlier on is in there as well. So basically what PhpStorm did was try to merge the two versions I had and make sure I have a version that works basically. Now this doesn't always work as good as this. So let's make a conflicting change now. Imagine I change this line in my source code, and let's say the webinar is over only in a couple of minutes, but we'll already add this to our README. So let's save this one. And I can also do the same through GitHub, maybe make a conflicting change there and say the webinar was held on October 2nd. Now again, I'm doing this in a very simple README file, but this also works, of course, with other source code as well. So added notice that the webinar took place on October 2nd. Commit changes, and let's do the same thing in our local repository through PhpStorm. So again, you see that I have some changes here. Let's use Control-K again to commit, and let's say I changed readme.md, and let's commit. What happens now is I commit again to my local repository. I could have also set to commit and push. I'll just push separately now. So I now have this entire revision in my local repository. I want to push it to GitHub. How can I do this? Again, through the VCS menu, or just by using the Alt-S shortcuts and selecting push for Git. Alt backtick. So you can see that all the changes I've done before, changed readme.md, merged a remote tracking branch, and added one file, and so on. All these changes haven't been committed to my GitHub repository yet. So I will be doing that right now, and I can say push. And as we can see, the push was rejected. Why was the push rejected? Well, we have a conflicting change. I made a change in my IDE, and maybe some other developer made a change as well. In this case, it was me through the web UI, but anyway, it's a conflicting change on the same line of code. So what I can do now is merge these lines of code. And what will happen is PhpStorm fetches the remote version, looks at my local version, and gives me an option to merge these things. The easy way, of course, is saying accept yours or accept theirs. Accept yours will tell PhpStorm to just make use of the version I have on my local repository. Accept theirs will say make use of the version that's on GitHub. Of course, that's the easy one and probably not the best one to go with. So typically you want to merge, and this will bring up a dialog in which you can sort of cherry pick the changes that have happened. So we can see on the left side, those are the local changes, so the changes that were made within PhpStorm here. On the right, we can see the changes from server, so we can see all the changes that have been done through GitHub. And in the middle, we can see the merge results. So let's say, maybe if I wanted to use my local version, I can use this one and it will change. Or maybe I can use the server version for this line, or maybe use both. So I can also make some other changes there, maybe add another return there and apply. So my merge result is now a completely different version, which is not yet on GitHub. So as you can see, my README has changed. Why did it change? Because I'm merging, and this merge is actually a new change, which is combining the changes I did earlier and the changes I did through GitHub. So what I can do now is commit. Commit. Apparently my commit doesn't really work. Okay, let's try pushing. Okay, sorry, my remote has been merged apparently. So let's push to GitHub. And our push this time was successful. So if we now go to GitHub, where we earlier didn't have the test.html file yet, it should be there right now. So as you can see, it's in there. And on GitHub, again, I can delete this file, make some other changes. So let's delete that one. And in my local PhpStorm, I can use Control-T again and fetch the remote version. There we are. I've deleted one file. I can see that again in my history. Also from the changes, you will see all the things that I've done during the past few minutes in the history. So you can see that I have done a merge. So you can see that I had two versions of my source code repository or of my code base, and that I've merged those here. So you can see that from this tree on the left. Okay. Now, I quickly want to run over some settings as well. So this is basic version control usage in PhpStorm and other IntelliJ IDEs. I quickly want to show you some of the settings that are available as well. So if I open my settings using the shortcuts and I go to the version control tab, I have a lot of options that I can specify. First of all, how does PhpStorm know that my current project is under version control? Well, I've set it that my current working directory is under Git source control. Fun thing is I can add additional directories. So for example, say that my public folder is under a different source control repository. So maybe I'm developing my front end in Subversion and my back end in Git. Well, I can map those things here and say that this specific folder is under Subversion. I can use multiple version control systems at the same time, but let's not go there for now. I can also specify some other things. So, for example, how many items I want to see in the local in the history. I can see. I can specify, for example, that I only want to show the changes from the last 31 days and not fetch the entire history that I have in my source repository. I can also configure all the confirmations. So earlier when I added the test.html, PhpStorm asked me if I wanted to add one to version control. I can specify defaults and say, well, whenever you do something, add it. Whenever you remove something, just remove it and don't ask me. So I can specify those things in here. I can also specify if version control operations should run on the background. So earlier when I was committing, basically what was happening, PhpStorm was running that commit in the background. If I want to have that commit as a blocking operation, where it requires my full attention, I can just disable this one and it will happen in the foreground and no longer in the background. There's some ignored files, so I can specify that I do not want to check in my workspace to my Git repository. I can specify my GitHub credentials, CVS settings, and so on. So basically, whatever source control system you're using, you can find the settings in here. Okay, cool. Another thing with version control is, imagine you are working on a file. Let's maybe select this calculation engine, remove some stuff there, save this thing, and I go home. So I close my PhpStorm and I go home. Now what? When going home on the train, I think, darn, the change I've done earlier, the code I've removed, I should get that one back. Well, what you can do is simply open up your PhpStorm again. Takes a while on my machine here. So you can just open up your PhpStorm again and make use of the version control system to revert changes and get those changes back. So that's pretty easy. So as you can see, if we go back to this file and I use the version control operations pop-up, I can just say I want to revert this file. Yes, revert. And you will see that the changes I've done should be reverted, so my code is back. Now imagine I was adding some code. Some comments, for example, more code, let's save, and then I've done a delete there, and then I've removed this one, and I choose to commit this file to source control. This gives me a couple of options. I can return to my last version, so let's remove that code again and revert this file again. I can, for example, revert to my current file again. Now, what's the issue here? I'm reverting to the last checkout or the last refresh I've done from my source control system, whereas maybe the lines of code I've added in between, well, maybe I need both of those. So how do you get those back? Well, typically you would use undo for that, so just use the undo functionality. But if you've closed your PhpStorm, well, then you have an issue. Well, not with PhpStorm actually, because you have local history there. So if we go to the version control system, local history, we can see the history for this file. And as you can see, we've done some changes there, but we can also see that we've added some comments there, so these guys. And maybe if I want to have these back, even though they are not in my source control system, I can use this local history functionality to get that one back as well, which is pretty useful in my opinion, especially in between commits. There's this mantra when working with source control, which is commit early and commit often, but maybe you do not want to commit broken code, or maybe you do not want to commit intermediate changes. And that is where either committing to a local repository or making use of the local history, which is very specific to IntelliJ-based IDEs. You can use that one to get those intermediate changes again. And as you can see, it's just a diff again between two versions. And now I have my previous version plus the lines of code I added somewhere in between. Okay. Something else you may be doing when working with source control is you may be using change lists. So for example, what may happen is you are changing code and you are changing tests at the same time. What you can do there is make use of change lists. So maybe this change in my tests is something that I would categorize under change to tests, for example. And maybe I'm doing a Readme change, which would be categorized under change documentation, for example. Well, what I can do is split those changes into multiple change lists. So from this changes tool window, I can create a new change list and say these are the unit test updates. I can create another one, which is updating docs. And I can move my files to those different change lists. Now, why would I do this? Well, it's pretty easy because I can keep working on different things in my IDE, but I can commit them separately. Typically, if you do a lot of changes, let's make a slight change here as well. If you do a lot of changes, you will see that you quickly have a clutter of different changes that you've made. And if you were to commit those changes, you would really have to cherry pick all those changes and make sure they get the correct commit message. If you're using change lists, what you can do is simply commit one of those change lists and say, I want to commit my unit test updates. And you see that the change list name gets populated there. And I can commit. Just commit. And I can also commit my updating documentation and commit. And even though I was making those changes at the same time during the same session based on the same revision and so on, by making use of these change lists, I didn't really have to cherry pick changes. And in my history, I can see I have updated my docs and updated my unit tests, for example. Another thing you may be doing when working with source control is making use of an issue tracker. Just like with version control systems, issue trackers exist in different flavors. For example, GitHub, if you're using GitHub for your source control, you also have an issue tracker there in which you can post bugs, assign tasks, and so on. So you can basically work with that one. JetBrains has one which is called utrack. There's a couple of others as well. But typically what you want to do with those inside your IDE is just make use of the description of that issue and use that description as a commit message whenever you are committing to source control. So what we can do next to VCS is make use of an issue tracker. So if we go to Tools, Tasks and Contexts, and Configure Servers, I can add an issue tracker as well. So let's say I want to add an issue tracker, and as you can see, it's sort of a unified view over different issue tracker systems. Let's say I want to work with GitHub. I can say this is Maarten Balliauw demo account. That's the project. And I want to create an API token. Basically, by connecting my GitHub account here, I can work with the tasks from that issue tracker. So let's click OK, and I now have linked an issue tracker to my current project. So what I can do now is search issues using Alt-Shift-N, for example, in Windows. I can see all the tasks that I have available. Now you see there's a create new task here. That's basically just for you to work with. It's not creating a new task on GitHub, just as a side note. But I can say, for example, that I want to work on this PHP Excel Business Logic issue 1, work on webinar demo. I can open that one. And PhpStorm will ask me if I want to clear my current context, which is basically revert changes to my latest fetch from, well, to my latest commit I have in my local repository. I can specify to create a branch, and I can specify to create a change list. Let's go with those defaults and click OK. If we now go to changes, you will see that under changes, we now have a list of changes, which is named after my issue. So what I can do now is simply make a change in my Readme, for example, save this thing, and maybe that's all that's required to finish this issue. I can now use the shortcuts to finish this task, which is Alt-Shift-W on my machine here, maybe different on Mac OS again as well. And when closing this task, PhpStorm will ask me if I want to commit changes and merge branches. So let's go with the defaults, click OK. And we see that we have an error because we have an empty commit message. Why is that? Yeah, okay. So again, from my tools, tasks, and contexts, configure service, I forgot something. I want to automatically add a commit message named after the issue I have. So I forgot to enable this checkbox. So let's finish my task again. So Alt-Shift-W. Say I want to commit changes and I want to close working on this task. Let's go with OK. And apparently I have a conflicting change again. Okay, I'm not going to continue on this one, but typically what you would do is just merge the changes you have there and commit and finish working on this task. And by combining the issue tracker with the version control system, what you will see is all your commit messages will contain a reference to an issue, which may contain attachments, which may contain repro steps if it's a bug. So you can basically fetch more information from your changelog by combining it with an issue tracker. Okay, I still have a couple of minutes. There's one very small thing I would still want to show you, which is shelving. So imagine I am working on this PHP Excel business logic and I've made a change there. And all of a sudden my boss runs in and tells me there's a bug, hair on fire, and there's something that should be hotfixed right now. How would you solve this? Well, I can commit to my source control repository, but the issue there is that I may have broken code in the repository, and we do not want broken code in the repository because that would mean potentially other developers on the team are getting broken code. So let's go to the Changes tool window here and say all the current changes we have here, well, shelve those changes. Shelving will actually put all the changes that we've done here onto a specific location in this hidden Git folder. And if we now go back to our change list, we see that our changes are back. We can fix this bug report we've received. Fix, save, and commit. So let's commit. If we now go back to the shelf, we can also unshelf those changes again on which we were working earlier. Unshelf those changes and we get those changes back. So we can start working on them again. So you can see that the line of code I removed is still removed in this shelf set, but the change I did because there was an urgent bug to be fixed has also been added there. So with that, there's a couple of more things you can do with version control, but I think these are the basics. I think I'm about through my talk here, so I don't know, Mikael, if there are any questions from the audience.
Thank you, Maarten. Yes, there are already some questions, and if you have some more questions, please post it to the questions pane right now so that we will be able to answer them during the webinar. So Maarten, the first question is about what should a newbie for VCS use? Like there is Git, SVN, and other version control systems. And if someone have never worked with VCS, what should they choose?
Well, my personal preference of a version control system currently is Git because it gives you a very flexible model where you can work with a centralized repository, like for example GitHub, and also work with a distributed version control system. Now, probably an easier version control system to get started with is Subversion. So Subversion basically gives you a centralized repository to which you can commit and from which you can fetch the changes that are in there. But it's limited to doing that and creating branches and so on as well. But it's limited if you're using version control for a long time. But then again, starting with Subversion is probably an easy one to get started with, although starting with Git shouldn't be too hard either. So again, I'm probably not answering your question the way you want me to answer it, like saying, please go that route. I would just say try some and find one that works for you and your workflow.
Thank you. We have for the next question. What is the shortcut for the VCS operations pop-up?
That's Alt backtick. So if you look at the VCS window, you can see there's this VCS operations pop-up. And based on the version of the IDE you are using and the operating system on which you are using it, this shortcut may be different, but Alt backquote is the one I have on my system. So this one opens this VCS operations pop-up.
Thank you. Next question is, can I put a single file in different change lists? I can manage it through my Git bash.
Okay, can I put the same file, sorry, in different change lists?
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
no. The idea of the change lists is that you are creating logical changes, grouping logical changes, but PhpStorm currently has no way of knowing which change belongs to which change lists. It's really based on the current file. So if you want to be doing those things, you would probably have to create one change list, make your change, commit that one, and do the second change in the same file.
Thank you. Next question. Is PhpStorm capable of acting as an issue tracker, or is just acting as a UI for a selected external one, as it's doing for a VCS?
Okay, so PhpStorm is actually just acting as a client for the issue tracker system, just like you are doing with VCS. What you can do in PhpStorm and in other IntelliJ IDEA-based IDEs is create tasks locally. So what I can do is use Alt-Shift-N, create a new task, which may be test as a change list, and I can give it a name as well. I forgot to give it a name. Anyway, make it a blank one. I can create local tasks, but those are just to structure my work that I'm doing. No one else will see these tasks that I'm creating here locally. But I can work on those tasks and commit those tasks separately. But those will not be added to the issue tracker.
Thank you. And one more question. Is it possible to manage a complete project in Git and Subversion at the same time?
Is it possible to manage a complete project in two version control systems at the same time?
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, I haven't tested it. I've shown you where you can map the different folders to a different source control system. So you can map, for example, one folder of your project to Subversion and one to GitHub, for example. But I haven't really tried working with the same code base in two different source control systems. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to answer that question afterwards through email.
Yeah, thank you. We also have some more questions arriving, and as we are running out of time, we will answer all the questions directly via email uh, in upcoming days. So stay tuned. And I'll just would like to help Martin for this webinar and get back the screen to show some useful links to follow up. Thank you, Martin.
You're welcome.
So if you would like to get more info about PhpStorm, you should go to jetbrains.com/phpstorm, and we would be really happy with any feedback on the webinar or on the product, and you can send it to Martin directly at martin.balliauw@jetbrains.com, or just file an issue or feature request at utrack.jetbrains.com. The video for this webinar will be available in a few days, Monday latest, on the PhpStorm channel at jetbrains.tv and JetBrains TV channel on YouTube. And also, you can check our blog at blog.jetbrains.com/phpstorm for updates and news on the product. And also, just to remind you, in about a month, we are going to release PhpStorm version 7, and the public preview is already available on the website. And if you would like to learn more about PhpStorm and